She was called the broken branch, the woman with no wolf unworthy of a crown. By sunrise, the Dark King himself would kneel at her feet, not from duty, but because she was the only person alive who could tame the beast inside him. Stay for the ending. What happens to the man who threw her away is one of the coldest reckonings in this story. Before we start, if you've ever been the one who did everything right and still got replaced, comment Team Tess right now. I want to see how many of you are staying until the end. Tess stood at the edge of the wine table in Dunlock's great hall, the scent of wood smoke and roasted meat thick around her, and watched Alpha Alistair walk past her without a glance. The drums had not yet stopped when he took her twin sister's hand and named her the future Luna of Dunlock, unaware that the woman he had just discarded would return by morning wearing the black symbol of a kingdom no one in that hall dared name aloud. Tess had arranged every torch, every guest, every route through the corridors for this ceremony, and still the nobles laughed when Alistair declared that a throne could not be built on a woman who only counted sacks of grain. She lowered her eyes and said nothing because saying nothing had kept her family fed through 5 winters. She did not yet know that beyond the frozen mountain pass, a king with no crown and a wolf he could barely hold in check had already turned his eyes toward Dunlock, toward the missing iron and the vanished soldiers no one else had noticed. "Some women are born to stand beside a throne," her sister said loud enough for the hall to hear, "and others are only suited to stand behind it." By the time the black banner reached the gate, Tess would already be gone. 5 years had passed since Tess reached the age when every wolf in Dunlock was expected to shift for the first time, and her body had never answered the call. In a pack that measured worth by fur and fang, a woman without a wolf spirit was considered defective. She could not inherit land or a title. She could not sit in the council. She could not stand among the warriors during a muster, and she was forbidden from wearing the family crest on her own shoulder. The pack had names for her that traveled faster than any formal title ever could. They called her the Silent Wolf. They called her half a woman. Among the older families, she was simply the broken branch. While her twin sister Tamsin trained with swords and learned to command a line of spears, Tess was kept behind the scenes, and the scenes never stopped needing her. She managed the grain stores that fed every hearth in Dunlock. She tracked the soldiers' daily rations down to the measured cup. She oversaw the medicinal herbs that kept fevers from turning into funerals, the iron and silver taxes that funded every wall and blade in the territory, and the supply wagons that had to cross frozen mountain passes before the snow closed them for the season. She kept lists carefully updated by hand of which families would need help surviving the winter and which could manage on their own. When the grain stores ran dangerously low, the pack searched for Tess. When soldiers returned from the border bleeding and half-frozen, they searched for Tess. When winter dragged on longer than anyone had prepared for, it was Tess they searched for first, before the healers, before the stewards, before anyone else in the fortress. And yet, when the question turned to who deserved to stand beside Alpha Alistair as Luna, the same people who depended on her decided without hesitation that Tess had nothing worth offering. No one in that hall admitted even quietly that Tamsin's 300 spears would starve before the first thaw, without the very system Tess had spent 5 years building stone by stone. Alistair understood her value better than any of them. That was precisely why he had chosen to marry Tamsin while quietly intending never to let Tess leave his territory at all. The ceremony had begun with Tamsin walking the length of the great hall in silver armor beneath a Luna's cloak, and the sight of that cloak had struck Tess harder than any of the whispered names ever had. She recognized every stitch of embroidery along its hem, because she had chosen the fabric herself, had sketched the pattern herself, on a night 2 winters ago when she still believed the cloak would one day rest on her own shoulders. Alistair had crossed the hall to remove the small iron brooch bearing Dunlock's crest from where it sat pinned above Tess's heart, and he had fastened it instead onto Tamsin's shoulder in front of the entire pack. He announced in a voice pitched to carry to the farthest corner of the hall that the symbol of Dunlock could no longer rest on a woman who had no wolf to defend it. An elder standing near the dais had ordered Tess to kneel and bless the new Luna so that no one watching could claim she opposed the union. Tess had refused. Alistair stepped close enough that only she could hear him and reminded her in a tone as calm as a man discussing the weather that her family still lived under his protection, and that protection could be withdrawn as easily as it had been given. Tess understood the shape of the threat immediately. She lowered her head not because an elder had commanded it, but because she would not let her mother and her younger cousins pay for her pride. Tamsin had crossed the space between them and placed one hand on Tess's shoulder without ever quite meeting her eyes, and said loud enough for the entire hall to carry the words to every corner of Dunlock that some women were born to stand beside a throne, and others were only suited to stand behind it. Tess felt the words land exactly where they were meant to land. She understood in that single moment that Tamsin had known about Alistair's decision long before the ceremony had ever begun. The betrayal in that hall had not come from one direction. It had come from both sides of the same blood. If someone said that to your face, would you have stayed silent like Tess did? Or would you have said something back? Drop your answer below. I read every one. The people who mocked Tess that night had already forgotten or had chosen never to learn that without her quiet accounting of every sack of grain and every measure of medicine, Dunlock would not have known how many days of food remained standing between the pack and starvation. None of them noticed the Black Wolf banner already moving through the mountain passes toward Dunlock. Alistair found Tess later that night among the sacks and crates of the food stores where the smell of dried grain and smoked meat had always felt more honest to her than the perfume of the Great Hall. He did not apologize. He told her as though reciting a fact rather than confessing a betrayal, that marrying Tamsin had been nothing more than a political decision and that Tess remained the only person in Dunlock he truly trusted. He asked her to continue exactly as before. He wanted her to keep managing the grain stores, keep auditing the taxes, keep quietly correcting whatever mistakes Tamsin would inevitably make, while learning to run a territory she had never been trained to run. In exchange, he said Tess would be permitted to remain in the fortress as a close companion of the Alpha, a phrase he offered as though it were a gift rather than a cage with a softer name. Tess understood exactly what he wanted from her. He wanted Tamsin on the throne because she carried an army into the marriage, 300 trained spears, a silver mine, and the loyalty of 3 border packs. He wanted Tess in the shadows because she carried something an army could never buy, the intelligence and quiet loyalty that had kept this territory breathing through 5 winters. He intended to possess both sisters at once, without ever having to make an honest choice between them. When she asked whether Tamsin knew about this proposal, Alistair said nothing at all. His silence told her everything. He had deceived both women, and he expected his power to be enough to force both of them into acceptance. Years earlier, when Alistair had been only the second son of Dunlock, with little real hope of inheriting anything, he used to slip away from his training sessions to find Tess exactly here, among the same sacks and crates. He told her once that Tamsin looked at him and saw a future alpha, while Tess was the only person who ever looked at him and saw the frightened young man standing beneath the title. Beneath the old pine tree at the edge of the training yard, he had pressed an iron ring into her palm and made her a promise in a voice she had believed completely. If I am ever given the right to choose, he had told her, I will choose you before the throne. When the right to choose finally came to him, he had chosen the throne. Tess reached into the collar of her dress and set the iron ring down on the open page of the food ledger between them. She asked him quietly why he had felt the need to humiliate her in front of the entire pack, if some part of him still loved her. Alistair answered without flinching, telling her that if he had shown her any softness in that hall, the pack would have questioned every decision he made afterward. Tess understood in that answer that he had not simply betrayed her. He had deliberately chosen to wound her in public because her pain was useful to him, a demonstration of strength for an audience that measured a leader by how little mercy he showed the people closest to him. She pushed the ring back toward him across the ledger and told him plainly that he had not chosen Tamsin because he loved her, and he was not keeping Tess because he loved her either. He had simply split one woman he wanted into 2 separate uses, one sister to bring him an army and another to keep his throne from quietly collapsing under its own weight. Something in Alistair's control broke at that. He crossed the space between them and seized her wrist, gripping it hard enough that she felt the bones shift beneath his fingers. He told her she was forbidden to leave Dunlock. He claimed that every ledger she had ever kept, every system she had ever built, belonged to the pack now and by extension to him. Tess looked down at his hand wrapped around her wrist and understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that the man standing in front of her was no longer the boy who had given her an iron ring beneath a pine tree. She ordered him calmly to release her. When he refused, she drew the small knife her mother had once carried and cut, the leather cord that had held the ring against her skin for 5 years. The blade caught the edge of his hand as she pulled it free, leaving a thin, shallow line of blood across his knuckles. It was not enough to wound him seriously. It was enough to tell him without a single raised word that she would not lower her head again. As she walked out of the food stores, a noble lingering in the corridor called after her, asking with a cruel little smile how it felt to be traded away for 300 spears. Tess glanced toward Tamsin, already seated in the Luna's chair at the far end of the hall, and answered that a stone falls because it is heavy, not because it hates the sky. When the noble failed to understand what she meant, she added that Alistair had not betrayed her because she was not good enough. He had betrayed her because his greed weighed more than his promise ever had. The great hall fell silent around her words. Alistair heard every one of them and found nothing to say in return. He believed walking away from that silence that he had stripped Tess of everything that mattered to her. He had no way of knowing that she was already preparing to leave Dunlock carrying evidence of a war no one else in that hall had noticed was coming. Tess returned to the small room behind the food stores and packed only what belonged to her alone. She took no jewelry, no formal dresses, nothing stamped with Dunlock's crest. Into a single worn bag went a change of clothing, her personal ledger, a small pouch of medicinal herbs, and her mother's skinning knife, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Before she left, she allowed herself one final look at Dunlock's main warehouse ledger, and what she found there stopped her hand mid-turn. 3 irregularities sat plainly in the columns, hidden only by the fact that no one else had ever cared to look closely enough to see them. Blood-clotting medicine had vanished from storage in quantities no infirmary could explain. 3 full months of iron taxes were missing without record of where they had gone. Wagons had departed at night, again and again carrying goods to recipients whose names were never written down. Tess had once assumed these gaps were simply the result of Alistair's careless management, one more small failure among many she had learned to quietly correct. Looking at the numbers now with nothing left to lose, by seeing clearly, she understood they told a different story. Someone in Dunlock was preparing for war. She copied the relevant pages by candlelight, folded them small, and hid them inside the lining of her cloak. For the first time in 5 years, she did not intend to fix what she had found. She intended to leave and let the people who had called her useless discover exactly how much they did not know. She reached the transport gate before dawn, the cold biting through her cloak when hoofbeats sounded beyond the stone walls. The guards on the towers went silent in a way that told her more than any shouted warning could have. Through the falling snow, a column of riders in black armor emerged from the tree line, their banner cutting through the gray morning, a black wolf beneath a silver moon. No one in Dunlock had been given any notice of this visit. The man riding at the front wore no crown, needed none. When he lifted his head, every wolf inside the fortress lowered itself without being told, to an instinct older than any law Dunlock had ever written. Dark King Torrin of Ethgard had arrived, and the first thing his eyes found was not Alistair, and not the newly named Luna standing somewhere behind the gates. It was Tess walking out with a small bag over her shoulder and a thin line of Alistair's blood still visible along the edge of her knife. Torrin had not ridden 3 days through the mountains to attend an engagement he had never been invited to celebrate. Over the previous 3 months, 4 of his border patrols had vanished without a trace. Iron taxes owed from Dunlock had quietly shrunk month after month. Wagons carrying medicine and grain had been diverted from their official routes without explanation. Torrin suspected someone was preparing a rebellion before the mountain passes closed for winter, and he had come without warning precisely so that no one would have time to hide what they had done. He entered the great hall still wearing a cloak heavy with melting snow. He required no introduction and accepted none of the ceremony offered to him, refusing both the honorary chair and the expensive wine set out in his honor. He asked only 3 questions. Where had the iron taxes gone? Who had changed the patrol routes along the border? Why was Dunlock's medical storage recorded as full when the infirmary shelves stood half empty? Alistair blamed low-ranking officials and the severity of the winter, his voice smooth and practiced. Torrin listened without expression. He knew a lie when he heard one, but he did not yet have the evidence to name it as such in front of the hall. The servants, unsettled by the Dark King's presence, kept their distance from him, and the task of carrying his wine fell to Tess. As she approached, Torrin caught something beneath the scent of wood smoke and spilled wine that made every hair along his arms rise. The cold, clean scent of pine after a storm. a trace of something like lightning, sharp and electric, and beneath, both older and quieter, the unmistakable trace of a power sealed so deep it had likely been hidden even from the woman carrying it. The black wolf inside him, restless and half feral on the best of days, went utterly still. He recognized her as his mate before she had said a single word to him. This is the moment everything changes. If you caught the twist coming, comment, "I called it." If not, comment, "Wow." And let's see who's still surprised by the end. Tess felt nothing in return because the wolf that should have answered his had never once stirred inside her in 23 years of waiting. When Torrin asked her name, Alistair cut in before she could answer, calling her Tamsin's useless twin, a woman with no wolf and no value worth mentioning at his own court. Tess said nothing to that. Instead, quietly, so that only Torrin could hear her, she told him not to drink from the cup in his hand. It had been switched somewhere between the kitchen and the hall, and the man who switched it had not done it carelessly. Torrin set the cup down without a word and looked at her for a long moment, understanding that the woman his court had just dismissed as worthless had noticed in seconds something his entire guard had missed. After the banquet had quieted, Torrin found her again in the food stores, as though he had already learned that this was the one room in Dunlock where Tess spoke without a wall between her words and her meaning. He told her directly, without softening it, that she was his mate. Tess had expected performance, some display meant to humiliate Alistair or pressure Dunlock into concessions, and she told him so plainly. "I have already been chosen and discarded once by a powerful man according to his political needs," she said. "I will not become another king's possession." Torrin did not mark her. He did not command her to leave with him, did not so much as raise his voice. Instead, he asked her with a directness that surprised her more than any declaration could have about the copied warehouse records she had hidden inside her cloak. Tess laid out what she had found. More blood-clotting medicine had been removed from storage than Dunlock could plausibly need for its own soldiers. Iron declared missing, and the ledgers kept leaving the fortress anyway, loaded onto wagons that departed only after dark. 3 border patrols had vanished, and each of them, according to the routing logs, had last inspected the same supply caravan before disappearing entirely. Torrin listened without interrupting and understood by the time she finished that the woman standing in front of him might hold the key to unraveling a rebellion his own scouts had failed to locate. He offered her a position in Ethgard as a royal advisor, stating the terms as plainly as she had stated her evidence: not a concubine, not a prisoner. Tess set 3 conditions before she would agree to anything. He would not mark her without her consent. She could leave if she discovered he had lied to her. She would be given access to whatever records the investigation required. Torrin accepted all 3 without hesitation, as though the terms cost him nothing at all to grant. The next morning, while Alistair and Tamsin prepared to sign the marriage alliance that would bind Dunlock and Tamsin's borrowed army together, Alistair believed Tess had already fled in shame, quietly disappeared to lick her wounds somewhere no one would have to look at her. As the agreement lay open on the table, ready to be sealed, the doors of the great hall opened wider than they had opened in years. Torrin entered with his royal guard behind him. Tess walked at his side, wearing a black cloak bearing the symbol of Ethgard across her shoulders, the same shoulders that had carried Dunlock's brooch only 2 days earlier. The woman the pack had treated as worthless the night before now stood beside the most feared king in the north, and the entire hall felt the shift in the air before anyone said a word. Alistair accused Torrin of stealing something that belonged to Dunlock. Torrin's answer came without heat, almost gentle in its precision. "Since when did she belong to you?" he asked. "Was it before or after you removed her from your own family in front of this entire hall?" Alistair, cornered, reached for the only weapon he had left and insulted Tess again in front of the court, listing everything she supposedly lacked. She could not shift. She commanded no army. She held no mine, no silver, no political weight of her own. He warned Torrin as though doing him a favor that Tess had nothing at all to offer a king. Torrin did not declare her his queen. He did not raise her onto a pedestal she had never asked for. Instead, he named her in front of the assembled nobles special advisor to the Crown's investigation into the missing iron and the vanished border patrols. "I do not need another beast capable of roaring inside my court," he told Alistair. "I need someone who can see a kingdom rotting before it collapses." When Alistair called her a broken branch one final time, hoping the words would land the way they always had, Torrin answered without raising his voice at all. "A broken branch can still point toward the place where the whole forest is burning." He confirmed before the entire hall that Tess had not been taken from Dunlock. She was leaving by her own decision, and no one in that room, least of all Alistair, had the standing left to say otherwise. Tess carried only her bag, her ledger, her herbs, and her mother's knife out of Dunlock. She left the iron ring on the table beside the marriage agreement. Alistair and Tamsin had never gotten the chance to sign a small, deliberate silence where a promise used to sit. Tamsin caught her arm before she reached the gate and asked in a low voice meant for no one else whether Tess would send word about what the Dark King was planning once she reached Ethgard. She warned that Torrin was dangerous and that Dunlock needed to know his intentions. Tess refused, and in refusing understood something about her sister she had not let herself see before. Tamsin did not fully trust Alistair either. Tamsin admitted quietly that she too had been used as a political piece to secure an alliance she had never truly chosen for herself. Alistair approached Tess one final time as she waited by the gate, offering to cancel the marriage entirely if she would only stay. Tess understood immediately that he did not regret hurting her. He feared losing the person who had kept his territory functioning while he took the credit for it. "You do not miss me because you love me," she told him. "You miss me because this morning no one in Dunlock knew how many days of grain were left in the stores." She walked out without looking back. The journey to Ethgard cut through mountains, buried in snow, and Torrin gave her a strong horse, a warm cloak, and the right to set her own pace, refusing to treat her as something fragile that needed managing. When the cold split the skin on her hands, when ice slicked the road beneath the horses, when a sudden storm forced the entire escort onto a longer, harder route, Tess said nothing and adjusted the same way she had adjusted to every hard winter of her life. On the first night's camp, she noticed the soldiers' rations had been divided unevenly, and before anyone else had thought to check, she had already recalculated the distribution so the whole escort would have enough to reach Ethgard without running short. When a guard was thrown from his horse on the ice and opened a deep gash along his forearm, Tess used her herbs and her steady knowledge of where a blade could stop bleeding without doing further harm, and the guard walked the next morning instead of being carried. The soldiers began to treat her with a quiet respect that had nothing to do with the word mate, and everything to do with what they had watched her do with her own 2 hands. Torrin kept every term he had promised her in the food stores of Dunlock. He did not mark her. He did not press the bond between them, did not allow a single guard to call her queen before she had chosen anything for herself. He slept apart from her at each camp and gave her the space to decide who he was to her rather than simply telling her. Tess noticed his restraint and still suspected more nights than not that he valued her only because she could read a ledger and find the rot hidden inside it. Torrin, for his part, noticed that she worked until she was nearly asleep on her feet, as though she believed usefulness was the only currency that would ever keep her welcome anywhere. He began asking her to rest, not as a king issuing an order, but as a man who seemed genuinely troubled by watching her push herself past the edge of exhaustion. Tess was not ready to trust love, but for the first time and longer than she could remember, she felt seen as a person rather than a tool someone intended to use. When they finally reached the fortress of Ethgard, the royal council opposed her presence, immediately refusing to accept that a woman without a wolf should be permitted anywhere near the kingdom's finances. Torrin did not hand her unlimited authority, and did not pretend the council's concerns were baseless. He granted her exactly 30 days of restricted access, enough to prove herself or fail entirely on her own merit. Tess began small with the records anyone could verify. She compared the soldiers' rations against the kitchen's own invoices. She measured recorded meat deliveries against what physically sat in storage. She checked the hospital's medicine logs against the transport records that were supposed to account for every shipment. Within days, she discovered that the head cook had been quietly selling food on the black market for months. She did not dismiss him on the spot. Instead, she followed the movement of the stolen food further than anyone expected her to, and found that the cook was only one small piece of a far wider network reaching well beyond the kitchens. She gathered her evidence carefully before bringing any of it to Torrin. The head cook was brought before the court to answer for what he had done. The kitchen workers, who had acted only because they were threatened, were spared and became witnesses instead of accused. And Ethgard's servants and soldiers began to trust Tess for a reason that had nothing to do with the king at all. She punished deliberate corruption without destroying the people who had simply been afraid. Deeper into Ethgard's tax records, Tess found something the head cook's small crimes had never hinted at. Lord Malcolm had purchased unusual quantities of blood-clotting medicine, dried food, winter animal hides, and iron logged under the harmless heading of agricultural tools. All of it had been transported to 3 fortresses that sat well outside Ethgard's official defense line, places no supply convoy should have had any legitimate reason to visit. When she laid the records side by side, the pattern sharpened into something she could no longer explain away as bureaucratic carelessness. Every one of the missing border patrols had, according to the routing logs, inspected one of Malcolm's caravans shortly before vanishing. The iron reported missing from Dunlock, once she calculated it against standard armament weights, was enough to equip nearly 1,000 soldiers. Several of the transport orders bore seals that claimed to belong to the Crown of Ethgard, seals Tess was certain had never been authorized by Torrin himself. Malcolm was not merely stealing from the Crown. He was arming a rebellion timed to strike before the winter snow sealed the mountain roads and made it impossible for Torrin to move his army quickly enough to respond. Tess still lacked the one piece of evidence that would close the case entirely: direct proof that Malcolm had ordered the missing patrols killed rather than simply diverted. She worked past midnight for 3 straight nights, to be certain before she brought any of it forward, spreading the ledgers across the floor of her chamber because the table was no longer large enough to hold everything she needed to compare at once. She cross-referenced dates against moon cycles, wagon drivers against known households, weights of iron against the number of blades a smith could reasonably forge from them. By the 3rd night, the shape of the coming war was no longer a suspicion. It was a map, and she had drawn nearly all of it herself. Malcolm's allies moved quickly once they sensed her getting close. Rumors began circulating through the fortress that Tess had somehow enchanted the Dark King, that she intended to seize control of the royal treasury for herself, that she was secretly still working for Dunlock, that a woman without a wolf had no business sitting anywhere near the council table at all. She overheard 2 servants repeating the rumor about the treasury outside the kitchens one morning, and said nothing, only noted quietly which household they served. During the next council meeting, several nobles demanded openly that Torrin remove her from Ethgard before she did any further damage. Lord Renner, a heavy-set man who had voted against every decision Torrin made since his coronation, rose first and declared that Ethgard did not need a wolfless outsider deciding which of its own lords deserved suspicion. Torrin did not defend her conclusions for her. He gave her the floor and let her defend them herself. Tess laid the invoices, the forged seals, the transport routes, and her iron calculations across the council table and dismantled every accusation raised against her, using nothing but the nobles' own records numbers they could not deny because their own scribes had written them. She answered Lord Renner directly, matching each of his objections against a dated entry until he had nothing left to counter with but his own silence. When Renner rose from his seat and moved toward her, as though he meant to physically drag her from the room, Torrin finally stood, and the entire chamber went still around him. "You may question her conclusions," he said, "but anyone who threatens a person serving this throne is threatening me." The victory that followed belonged entirely to Tess's own intelligence, not to the king's protection standing behind her. She understood that Malcolm would not move against the crown while he still believed his network remained hidden, so she proposed a winter banquet at Ethgard, inviting every noble of consequence in the kingdom. Officially, Torrin would announce how the crown intended to distribute food through the winter. Privately, Tess intended to force Malcolm into the open to make him believe the moment to strike had finally arrived. Before the banquet, she worked quietly through every detail, the way she had once planned the distribution of grain across an entire starving winter. Except now the thing she was rationing was risk. She had the guards replaced at every gate with soldiers she had personally verified as loyal, checking each name against records of who had served during the years Malcolm's caravans first began moving at night. She emptied the secret armory Malcolm's people did not know she had already located, carting the weapons out under the cover of a false inventory count. She positioned trusted soldiers inside the kitchens and the wine cellar, and marked every bottle that would enter the hall that night, with a small notch along the base of the glass, invisible, unless a hand already knew to look for it. She let it slip carefully and deliberately through a servant she suspected of loose loyalty that Torrin intended to reveal the locations of Ethgard's emergency food stores during his address. Malcolm took the bait exactly as she had hoped. He believed that killing Torin during the banquet would hand him both the throne and control of the winter supplies in a single stroke, and that a hall full of drunken nobles would be too slow, too soft to stop him before the deed was done. The banquet began warm light and full tables filling a hall that Tess had spent days quietly turning into a trap no one else could see. Musicians played near the far wall, wine moved from table to table, and beneath the noise and the laughter, Tess kept her attention fixed on the doors, counting faces against the list of servants she had personally approved that morning. She noticed one man almost immediately, a servant wearing military boots beneath his uniform, unfamiliar with the proper way to pour Ethgard's ceremonial wine, his hands carrying the faint smell of metal and medicinal herbs beneath the scent of the kitchen. She watched him tip something into Torin's cup when he thought no one was looking, and saw a moment later the outline of a blade hidden inside his sleeve. Tess caught Torin's eyes across the hall, and held them just long enough to warn him without a single word spoken aloud. For a moment the ordinary noise of the banquet nearly swallowed what she had seen, the clatter of plates, a burst of laughter from a table of visiting lords, a musician sliding into a new song without missing a beat. Tess forced herself to stay still, to keep her expression unreadable, because if she moved too quickly, if she so much as reached for her own knife, too soon the man would know his cover was already gone and choose a faster, uglier way to finish what he had come to do. She had learned patience the hard way, standing behind wine tables while other people made the decisions that shaped her life, and now that same patience was the only thing standing between Torin and a blade meant for his ribs. She thought in the half-second before she moved of every ledger page that had led to this hall, every wagon route and forged seal that had carried her from a servant's place at the edge of a room in Dunlock to a woman capable of reading danger in the tilt of a stranger's wrist. Malcolm had spent months building an army out of stolen iron and silence. Tess had spent the same months building something quieter and far harder, to burn down a full accounting of every lie he had told and the patience to wait until he believed he had already won. The assassin realized in that same instant that he had been seen. He abandoned the cup entirely and lunged straight for the king. Tess drew her mother's skinning knife and caught the assassin's first strike on the flat of the blade, buying half a second that felt in the moment like an entire lifetime. She did not fight like a trained warrior because she was not one. She fought with what she actually had: years of studying anatomy while treating wounded soldiers, a steady understanding of where a body could be stopped without a single wasted movement, and a calm that had been forged by 5 winters of crisis after crisis with no room left in it for panic. When the assassin turned for a second strike, she drove the blade into the artery beneath his arm, and he collapsed before he ever reached Torin. The wound she took in return, a shallow cut across her shoulder, barely registered in the moment. She was already shouting the order to lock every door of the banquet hall before the pain had time to catch up with her. That single command became the signal, though she had not intended it as one. Somewhere beyond the hall, Malcolm's soldiers took the sudden lockdown as their cue to move. He ordered his men to seize the armory and force open the eastern gate, expecting a straightforward strike against a court that would still be reeling from the assassination he had assumed would already be finished. His men found nothing waiting for them but the consequences of underestimating a woman who read ledgers for a living. Tess had already emptied the armory days earlier down to the last blade, and stacked the crates in a storeroom only 3 people in the fortress knew existed. The rebels reached the racks expecting steel and found only dust and empty hooks along the walls. Loyal guards, handpicked and quietly repositioned over the preceding week, controlled the eastern gate before the rebels ever reached it, holding the line with a discipline that came from knowing exactly what they were defending and why. The rebel groups scattered inside the fortress found themselves cut off from one another, trapped in separate sections of the keep, with no way to coordinate, shouting through locked doors to allies who could no longer hear them over the noise of their own confusion. Outside the walls, Malcolm's remaining forces were intercepted using the exact supply routes Tess had traced weeks earlier in the transport records, ambushed at the same narrow mountain passes his own caravans had once used to move stolen iron routes. His own network had unknowingly revealed to the very woman he had called worthless. Word of each failure reached the great hall in pieces carried by breathless runners who had to shout to be heard over the chaos still unfolding around the high table. Every report was the same shape: men expecting weapons and finding none, men expecting reinforcements and finding locked doors, men expecting confusion and finding a fortress that had already known they were coming. Tess had spent weeks preparing for a rebellion. Malcolm believed no one had noticed, and now that preparation was unfolding exactly as she had mapped it, one failed objective at a time. While Malcolm stood in the middle of the hall, discovering that every contingency he had built his war around had already been quietly dismantled beneath him. Malcolm understood, standing in the wreckage of a plan that had taken months to build, that he had been defeated before his rebellion had truly begun. His soldiers had no weapons to fight with. His allies inside the fortress could not reach one another to regroup. His forces outside the walls could not break through to the eastern gate. The very records he had used to build his war had become the map Tess used to take it apart piece by piece, long before he ever gave the order to strike. With every other option gone, Malcolm turned to the only weapon he had left. He announced loud enough for the entire hall to hear that the missing border patrols had not simply vanished. They had been tortured and killed to keep his weapon shipments hidden. He claimed, twisting the truth into something sharper, that some of those soldiers had begged for Torrin to save them and had been abandoned instead. He wanted the Dark King to break, to lose control in front of the entire court, to prove with his own hands that he was exactly the kind of monster the North had always feared him to be. It worked. The restraint Torrin had held for years cracked open in a single moment, and the wolf beneath his skin surged forward, transforming him into a massive black beast in the middle of the banquet hall. He tore through the rebels, still fighting, killing without hesitation, until he had Malcolm pinned against the stone wall with nowhere left to run. Malcolm did not stop provoking him even then. He wanted Torrin to slaughter the prisoners who had already surrendered, unarmed men kneeling with their hands raised. Because if the Dark King butchered defenseless soldiers in front of the entire court, Malcolm could still claim with his dying breath, if necessary, that Torrin was an uncontrollable monster never fit to hold a throne in the first place. No one in the hall dared step closer to the Black Wolf pinning Malcolm against the wall. Overturned tables lay across the floor, wine and blood pooling together. Between the stones, and the nobles who had spent the evening laughing over roasted meat now pressed themselves against the far walls, too frightened to speak above a whisper. The royal guards pulled Tess back and warned her that Torrin had injured anyone who touched him during a transformation, before that whatever remained of the man inside the beast was buried too deep to reach. Tess walked across the blood-covered floor anyway. Something inside her, some part of the bond she had never felt stir before, began to wake, even though her own wolf still had not answered after 23 years of silence. She reached out and placed her bare hand against the Black Wolf's muzzle and spoke his name instead of his title. "Torrin, you have already won," she said. "Do not let the beast turn this victory into something you will spend the rest of your reign regretting." He kept growling low and rough, but he did not turn on her. Tess reminded him, steady and unhurried, that Malcolm wanted exactly this. Wanted the entire court to watch the Dark King slaughter defenseless men so that his last act could still be called a victory. She told him to return to himself, to let Malcolm answer for what he had done through the evidence they had spent weeks gathering, rather than through a massacre no one in that hall would ever forget. Slowly the wolf's shoulders eased, and Torrin shifted back into the shape of a man standing in the wreckage of his own banquet hall. He looked down at the blood soaking into the stone at his feet, and Tess, glancing at the same mess, said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud. "And you are making a mess of my floor." Torrin laughed, the first real laugh anyone in that court had ever heard from him, and the sound cut through the tension in the hall more completely than any decree could have. The nobles watching understood in that single unguarded moment that Tess was the only person in the kingdom capable of standing before both the king and the beast, without ever lowering her head to either one. The guards who had watched her cross that floor without flinching began that night to tell the story differently than the nobles did. Where the council would later speak of the assassination attempt and the rebellion put down, the soldiers spoke, instead of a woman, with no wolf of her own, who had walked toward a killing beast because she trusted her own read of him more than she trusted her own fear. It was a smaller story, and it spread faster than any official account past kitchen to barracks to gate long before the trial itself began. Malcolm did not die on the floor of that banquet hall. He was dragged in chains to stand trial instead, faced day after day with the forged transportation records, the head cook's testimony, the weapons forged from the iron he had stolen, and the evidence Tess had gathered proving the missing patrols had been murdered to protect his shipments. He tried twice to claim the records had been fabricated, and twice Tess answered him in front of the court with the same calm precision she had used to dismantle every rumor sent against her, walking the judges line by line through seals, dates, and weights, until even his own remaining allies stopped meeting his eyes. His noble allies were stripped of their lands and their titles one by one, and the wealth seized from them was redirected to support the families of the soldiers who had died protecting a kingdom that had never known what was being taken from it. Torrhen stood before the full court afterward and admitted without the armor of a king's pride that Tess's calm had stopped him from making the single greatest mistake of his reign. Torrhen just admitted in front of his entire court that she saved him from himself. Comment below, is that enough to earn her trust back, or does he still owe her more? Tess did not become queen the morning after the banquet. She was named royal steward instead, given charge over the food stores, the taxes, the transport routes, and the aid sent out to the kingdom's poorer packs. Through the months that followed, Ethgard survived the winter without famine, recovered tax losses no one had noticed bleeding away for years, rebuilt its border patrol stations, and found a way to support the families of every soldier who had died protecting a kingdom that had never fully understood what it owed them. The people began calling her the Queen of Winter long before any crown was placed on her head. They said Torrhen protected the kingdom with claws and fangs, while Tess kept it alive with food, medicine, and numbers no one else had thought to check. Slowly, something inside her that had been silent for 23 years began to stir. She had never truly been without a wolf. Her power had simply been sealed since childhood, a bloodline capable of calming ancient wolves, stabilizing mate bonds, and sensing imbalance inside a pack before it broke apart entirely. Torrhen reminded her gently that he had chosen her long before either of them knew any of that was true. Tess began slowly to let go of the belief that she only deserved love when she was useful or powerful enough to earn it. Alistair and Tamsin arrived at Ethgard that spring asking for the missing iron taxes to be forgiven. Dunlock was facing food shortages of its own. Now the weaknesses in its management no longer hidden behind the quiet system Tess had spent 5 years maintaining without credit. Alistair asked her to remember what they had once been to each other to help him hold on to what little authority he had left. Tess refused to grant him any special treatment, though she made sure the ordinary people of Dunlock would not go hungry for his mistakes. "The people of Dunlock will not pay for their lord's greed," she told him, "but you will repay every coin and every bar of iron that disappeared." Alistair's private wealth and his mining rights were seized to settle the debt in full, and he lost his position as Alpha once the army and council both stopped trusting him. Alistair arrived at Ethgard's gates without guards, without his title, wearing a traveling cloak instead of the furs of an Alpha. He asked to see her alone, and when the doors opened, he did not stand tall, the way he had in Dunlock's Great Hall. He knelt in front of the same ledger he had once told her belonged to the pack, and by extension to him. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I am asking you to remember that I taught myself too late that I built my throne on the one person I never bothered to actually see." Tess did not kneel beside him, and she did not raise him up either. She let him stay, exactly where he was, long enough for every guard in the hall to see it. Then she told him the only mercy she had left to give the people of Dunlock would eat this winter. He would not. Tamsin admitted without excuse that she had known Alistair was greedy, and had believed she could control him anyway, and that she had chosen power over protecting her own sister when it mattered most. Tess did not forgive her immediately. She offered her a path back instead, end the marriage agreement, return the silver mine to the council's control, and accept responsibility for rebuilding what Dunlock had lost. Tamsin agreed, and was allowed to become Dunlock's new Alpha under Ethgard's watchful supervision. When winter finally ended, Ethgard's council recognized Tess as Torrhen's co-ruler. "The mate bond only let me recognize her," Torrhen told them. "Her choices are what made her a queen." Tess accepted the title of Queen of Winter and chose on her own terms, this time to accept Torrhen's mark, knowing, by then, that he had loved her long before he ever learned what her bloodline could do or what her skills were worth to his court. He told her she was the only person alive capable of commanding both the king and the wolf inside him. She told him she only needed him to remember who would be the one cleaning the floor after every transformation. They stood together on the walls of Ethgard as the winter snow finally began to melt, supply wagons rolling out toward packs that had once gone without. The black wolf banner flew beside a new symbol stitched at Tess's own hand, a silver stone beneath a pine branch. She understood at last that she had never been a broken branch at all. She had been the stone that had quietly held an entire kingdom upright long before anyone thought to notice. If you believe the quiet ones are usually the strongest ones in the room, subscribe and tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one, and I've got another story just like this one waiting for you next.